Good morning, I'm Liz Hudswell, a member of the church family here, and our Bible reading this morning is on page 970. It's from Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 48. Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 48, page 970. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Good morning, I'm Chris Webb, one of the ministers here, and I'm going to preach on this famous passage, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, which is famous but very difficult to put into practice. So one of the basics of life has always been to defend yourself. I was 10 years old when we moved suddenly from Chelmsford in Essex to Port Talbot in South Wales. And my new friends were introducing me to the sort of pecking order at school. And this little boy said to me, if he starts it, you finish it. If he starts it, run as fast as you can. The band Aerosmith put it like this: don't get mad, get even. I don't want to know anything about the rugby this morning. Mrs. Webber nearly gave it away. But you'd spoil my birthday if you told me the score. I want to watch it later. But in 1974, the British Lions toured South Africa. And they had a ploy to deal with the physicality and the aggression of the box. The tour was famed for its call of 99. When the captain of the British Lions shouted 99, each player on the Lions team was to round on the opposition number of the South Africans and try and physically overcome them in order to gain a physical advantage and sometimes retribution for what had gone on during the game. One of my favorite books that I've ever read is The Count of Monte Cristo. Who's read that book? Oh, a few of you. It's a good movie as well. And a young man in that book gets betrayed by his mates and locked up in the Château d'If, which is this great big prison castle off the coast of Marseille. And he's in a dungeon for 13 years, grim years. But eventually, he finds a way to escape. He swims to shore. He finds a huge treasure. And for the rest of the book, he uses this treasure to slowly gain vengeance and retribution on those friends that shafted him 13 years before. There is something very satisfying about people getting their comeuppance. Children and adults have a penchant for retaliation. He started it first. And almost every culture has developed some kind of dueling, where a person can defend their honor and gain satisfaction on the dueling ground, where you take 20 paces and then you turn and you shoot. That's how Alexander Hamilton met his end in 1804 through the bullet of Aaron Burr, and our own Prime Minister William Pitt nearly met the same fate in 1806 I was thinking maybe it would be a good way to settle the Brexit issue. But actually, Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, tells us to live by a very different set of values. 6 times he says, you've heard it said, this has been traditionally taught and done, but I say to you this. 6 times he tells his disciples that they need to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, what has been traditionally taught in Jewish religion. They need to go beyond that. Now, I've often heard it said that the ethics in the Sermon on the Mount are the very same kind of ethics in all religions. Every religion teaches to love and to turn the other cheek. But actually, on examination, I think that's very untrue. If you insult or curse or defame the Prophet Muhammad in an Islamic country, the penalty is death. Now, he would have been a brilliant, charismatic leader, but I don't think he ever taught to turn the other cheek. And last Sunday evening, if you were at the Real Lives presentation with Raheel Patel, he told his incredible story of being a Hindu priest for 20 years, and how both Hinduism and Buddhism have their own versions of retribution through what is known as karma. The logic of karma is that people who are suffering at this present time are reaping what they have sown, either in this life or in a previous life. The person dying with cancer is receiving this through karma. It's actually very cruel. Now, Jesus' teaching is very, very different from those of the other religions, very unique. It contrasted with the religion at the time, and it contrasts with all philosophies and religions and ways of life today. Nobody actually ever taught and put into practice what he taught, like Jesus, who died praying, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. Secular humanism doesn't give us the basis for an ethic of loving your enemies. If secular humanism is all about evolution and the strongest thriving and surviving, sometimes to the cost of those who are not so strong. So Jesus says, you've heard it said, and that applies to all philosophies and traditional ways of teaching. But I say to you, this is completely new and different. When Jesus taught the Sermon on the Mount, he was teaching an inner group of disciples, and there was an outer group, the crowds that were listening in. And Jesus wanted to draw them in, and draw them in he did, because at the end of the sermon, we read Matthew telling us the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he taught like nobody else with such authority. But Jesus was teaching this inner group that they needed to live life in such a way that people in the crowds who are not Christians should be able to see what God's rule and reign, what his kingdom looks like. In other words, the disciples of Jesus should be gentler. They should be less selfish, less proud, more faithful in their relationships, dealing with lust in a different way, less worried about saving face, more forgiving, more dominated by an ethic of love and not vengeance. And actually, says Jesus, this will bring you more joy, and it will radiate, and the crowds will look on in amazement. But Jesus' teaching and his manifesto is so extraordinarily countercultural, and many have dismissed it as great teaching but unrealistic. Perhaps you might think it's like the manifesto presented in the Queen's speech last week. It sounds great, but how on earth is that ever going to happen? How is it possible to love your enemies? Are you serious? So I want to go through the text now and leave that question hanging. How is this possible? How can we live like Jesus teaches us to live? I want to leave that to the end, but I want to look at the 3 imperatives that Jesus teaches in this sermon. Firstly, do not retaliate, verses 38 to 42. Love your enemies, verses 43 to 47. And then be perfect, verse 48. So firstly, do not retaliate, verses 38 to 42. You've heard it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, now that would be a backhander, So if I'm going to slap you on the right cheek, I can't go like that. It would need to be like that, which is very, very insulting. It would be a way that a bad master would treat his slave, very, very demeaning. But Jesus says, you've heard it said, resist an evil person, but I tell you, turn the other cheek. Now, there seems to be a contradiction between what is taught in the Old Testament, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and what is taught in the New Testament, turn the other cheek. How do we reconcile that supposed kind of contradiction? Well, the point is that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, or what has been called the law of lex talionis, which you can read about in the Old Testament in Exodus 21, Leviticus 24, Deuteronomy 19, was actually a rule for judges. It was a rule for the civil courts, and it was meant to stop personal revenge and ensure that in the land all punishments fitted the crime. See, if you compare the Jewish laws with the Babylonian laws at the time, if you read the Code of Hammurabi, you see that the Jewish laws were far more humane than any laws at the time, because they had this system where in the courts, revenge was limited and the punishment fitted the crime. It wouldn't be that an eye was always exacted for an eye. It was a way of saying the punishment must fit the crime. Now here's an illustration from Huckleberry Finn to make the point. Here's a conversation between between Huckleberry Finn and Buck. So Huck says to Buck, "What's a feud, Buck?" "Why, where was you raised, Huck? Don't you know what a feud is?" "I never heard it before. Tell me about it." "Well, a feud is this way. A man has a quarrel with another man, and he kills him. And then the other man's brother kills him. And then the older brothers on both sides goes for one another. And then the cousins chip in, and by, everybody's killed off, and there ain't no more feud. But it's kind of slow, and it takes a long time." Well, this law, lex talionis, was exactly so that kind of feuding didn't happen. It was a law so that restitution was made in an orderly and a speedy way through the courts. Lex talionis was not a law for relationships, but the Pharisees were misapplying it to relationships. So Jesus says, turn the other cheek. What does he mean by this? Well, he's saying that despite a terrible insult that will come to us in life, if you haven't been insulted by someone, you will be. Jesus says, don't let it close the door forever on your relationship. Love means that sometimes you, as the wronged party, are saying, "You've insulted me, but I want to give you another chance to make it right." Jesus is saying that there can be when we're insulted, a Christian discipleship response and a non-Christian response. The non-Christian response to being insulted is, right, forget it. I'm going to get my own back on you. I'm not going to forgive you. Or the Christian way is to give the cold shoulder, to make sure that person realizes that they've offended you and they're in your bad books, and we can use all kind of passive-aggressive means. But the Christian response is, hey, what you've done is wrong, and I really want justice. But if you ever want to get back into a decent relationship, I'm ready. You slap this one, but if you want to come back and kiss this one, because that's how they greeted one another, then I'm ready. Now, I'm new at Above Bar. I don't know really what relationships are like here. But maybe the communion table, which we will come to in a few minutes, is a good time to reflect where we are in relationships, with friends, with family, and to ask the Lord to help us to do what we can to make them better. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, turn the other cheek. The second illustration of don't retaliate is where a man is likely to lose his tunic in a lawsuit. And Jesus says, if that happens to you, let him have your cloak as well. So if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Jesus is saying that even those things that we think of ours as rights by law, sometimes for the sake of love, we need to be prepared to abandon them. And as I was thinking of an illustration for this, it was quite close to home. Because for the past 5 years, we lived in Chiang Mai in Thailand and went to serve as a teacher. And the school building that we initially went to serve in was beautiful. I loved it. There was a swimming pool, an open-air swimming pool, which I went into every single day after teaching. There were tennis courts, and there were beautiful football pitches that the kids played on and had coaching on 4 times a week after school. But the school lost a court case against a neighbor who was also a judge. And the way it works in Thailand is that if someone like that takes you as a foreigner to court, they will always win. And that's what happened. He had his view blocked by one of the dorms that was built at the school. And so he had a kind of vendetta against the school, and he won the case. And what that meant was the school was actually given a few weeks to vacate and find somewhere else. And the school was thinking of, tents on a field. It actually found a Thai school, which we've shared the building of for the last 3 years. We were all forced to leave and hand the building back to the neighborhood. And since the school left that building, the swimming pool has never been used. The beautiful football pitch is now the home of cobras and other snakes. It looks like a jungle. And the building hasn't been used since. Now, I used to play tennis every week. I didn't know this at the time. But the guys I was playing tennis with were the same guys that sued the school. So when I found that out, it was a big temptation, when I was serving, to actually smack it in the back of the head of the guy. But actually, all in all, the staff at the school demonstrated great grace and humor. And the reason I say that is the fruits. During that period, a couple of the security guards got converted and have become disciples of Jesus Christ, Buddhist people, and they've become followers of Jesus. And the reason for that is, part of their testimony was they were amazed that the school could show such grace to its opponents. And they began to understand what the name of the school, Grace International School, actually meant. The third example of Jesus here, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles, probably refers to the Roman practice of commandeering a civilian for a task like carrying the bags. So an ordinary Roman soldier could legally get someone and say, "Oi, you, carry my bag." And legally it was 1 mile. I think literally 1,000 paces. And Jesus was saying, if a Roman soldier does that to you, offer to go with him too. Now, some of the commentaries I was reading were saying, well, maybe this is a witty way to kind of challenge injustice. I'm not sure, but it does raise some questions. The question for me is, well, shouldn't we stand up to injustice? Are we supposed to be doormats? Now, justice is not the same as vengeance and retaliation. Christians should stand up for justice, and Christians at their best have always done that. Jesus isn't saying that we should just be doormats, because Jesus at his own trial was slapped, and he actually protested, and so did the Apostle Paul. When he was beaten, he said, "Hey," and he appealed to the law. He says, "You can't beat a Roman citizen," and he appealed to Rome. He didn't literally turn the other cheek. And Jesus could get angry too, couldn't he? Remember in the temple, he made a cord of whips, and he drove out the money changers and turned over tables. Jesus certainly wasn't a doormat, nor does he encourage us to be. So we shouldn't think that we're prohibited from standing up for justice and the rule of law, but we are prohibited from taking the law into our own hands and exacting retribution in personal relationships. The fourth example that Jesus gives, give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you, really challenges us not to be tight-fisted, penny-pinching Scrooges. Because we default to a legalistic mentality that can focus on our rights. I deserve this. This is mine. I've bought it. It belongs to me. That's the way we're raised. Make sure we don't lose out. We're not shafted by somebody. Now, Jesus is not asking us to help fraudsters or professional beggars or drunkards. And we're not necessarily to take his words literally. Martin Luther talked about monks who wouldn't even kill a flea on their leg that was sucking their blood. And some Buddhists are as strict as that as well. We're not to take his words completely literally and become pacifists, but we are to take them seriously. The ethic of love does mean that sometimes we may have to give up our rights. And for some of us, that may mean really stepping out of the bubble much more than we do at the moment. You see, if you're like me, you don't want to have enemies. And so what you want to do is to pull yourself into a tighter and tighter circle or bubble with just people like you as friends so that you won't ever be hurt, so that you won't have enemies. And so you wrap your heart around with hobbies and you really only mix with people who are like you. So Jesus' words are extremely challenging to us. They're saying to us, step out of the bubble, and then you may have enemies. Then you may have to love the unlovely. And Ruth is going to come and share with us some opportunities that we have above bar to step out of the bubble.
Hi there. So yes, the question I got asked was, how do we get out of our bubble world? And I have to be totally honest with you. God has really taken me on a journey through this. We're trying to work this issue through, particularly, I would say, in the last 6 months, a year, kind of short term. I think it has challenged a lot of what I thought I knew. I think I have felt very uncomfortable while looking into this area in particular. And I think it's really made me question what I was doing before, which is quite a disarming place to be. So I think what I used to think was that we should invite people into what we already have, because what we have is so good. Why wouldn't they want to be part of that? And while that works for the ones and twos, and I've got Christian friends now who weren't Christians before we invited them in, so they become Christians through that process, I think it takes quite a confident, independent-minded person who can come into a group of well-established people who, to be quite honest, look the same, behave the same, act the same, believe the same. You have to really know who you are, and you have to be prepared to take on that challenge if you're going to be comfortable in that environment. So while I was saying before, let's invite people in, let's get people to come and join our clique, it doesn't actually challenge us as Christians to really get outside of our comfort zone. So the journey that God's taken me on is a completely different one to that, actually. And what I'm now realizing more than ever is that God's saying we need to get out onto their turf. We need to be in their environment, because that way we put ourselves in a position where God can fully use us. It's a scary place to be, but it's a very, very exciting place to be when you realize that you can stand on your own 2 feet in the minority and still be Jesus in that environment. It's exciting. So lots of thoughts for me about getting out of our bubble world. I think there are opportunities to show Jesus through, obviously, where you work, your everyday life. There are also unique opportunities to get out of that everyday life and to do something a little bit differently. And I wanted to tell you about some work that I've been doing, which has taken me out of my everyday environment. So I've been going into prison for about 6 months now. I've been in Winchester prison. In fact, my husband is there this morning, taking a service in there. But I've been going into Winchester prison and Wormwood Scrubs in London with the HTB Alpha team. And I can honestly tell you it has been one of the top, probably 5 highlights of my last 20 years of being a Christian. It has been an incredible experience. So we, as a team, have been going in. We've been meeting people who are, different to me. I haven't been in prison. I haven't come from that background, but it's enabled me to connect with people in a completely different way. And actually, when you get to talk to people, you realize they are really just like you. There really is no difference. In fact, in prison, I would say I have met some of the friendliest, the most reflective people, people able to own up to their mistakes in a much easier way than probably I could. It has taught me an awful lot. We are starting to look at some prison work here at Above Bar Church. We're looking at a scheme at the moment headed up by a guy who's been doing prison work for a number of years, and he's working with somebody that's spent time in prison. The pair of them are kind of getting this work up and running with me. So we're looking at a scheme where we try and connect with people that have been on the inside. And that could be anything from 6 months. Some of them, particularly in Winchester, are life prisoners who will never see the outside. But we're picking up people through the Alpha course. And if they do have the chance to come out of prison, what we're hoping is that we, as a church, can connect with them and we can visit them in prison to get to know them. We're hoping that we can then pick them up at the gates on the scariest day of their lives, probably on release day. It is the most terrifying day for them. And then we're going to walk that journey through with them for the 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, whatever it is. It's a befriending scheme that allows us to connect with people who have had very different life experiences to us, but it's very exciting. If you feel like you're in a bubble world, I think I felt like I was in a bubble world for quite a long time. If you feel like you're in a bubble world and you want to do something a little bit differently, please get involved with some of the things that are going on at church. There are a multitude of ways you can meet people that are different to you. And honestly, it will be the most exciting journey for you. It not only blesses the people that you will come into contact with, it's a phenomenal blessing to you as well. It will change you, and you won't leave that initiative in the same way as you went into it. So I want to give you a few examples. If prison work is not your thing, I don't know why it wouldn't be, but apparently it isn't everyone's thing. If it's not your thing, there are plenty of other ways you can get involved. We have a homeless initiative. We have opportunities to work with young offenders before they get into the prison system. There's international work, there's CAP work, there's student work, there's young adult work. There are so many ways you can connect. If none of those things, if you're sitting there thinking, just not doing it for me, none of those things are actually, ringing any bells for me, come and talk to us. I don't think I've ever said no to anybody about wanting to get involved. If someone says, could we go to the moon and back, I'd probably go, yeah, let's do that. Let's make that happen. Please come and talk to us. We'd love to hear your ideas, particularly if it's around connecting with people that are like you, but you just want to get out that bubble world and push it a little bit further to the next stage. Love to hear from you. So yeah, being Jesus where we are, but also intentionally stepping out as well in faith, and it has the most incredible results. Thanks, Chris.
Very challenging when I hear that. Okay, let's talk about loving your enemies. Jesus carries on in verse 43. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven, who causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Now, this wasn't actually the Old Testament law, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. The Old Testament law said, love your neighbor as yourself. The words hate your enemy were a tumor on the law of God. They had no place there. So Jesus contradicts that addition straightforwardly and says, I want you to love your enemies. Why? Because this is how God has treated you. When we come to the communion table, we're going to be reminded that in Romans chapter 5, Christ died for us while we were enemies. in order to reconcile us to God. He gave his back to the whipping. He gave his head to the crown of thorns. He gave his body to the cross for us when we were enemies, in order to bring us back together with God. So when we love the enemy, we're reflecting the heart of the Father. I had an amazing chat the other day with my friend Paul Bradley. He was a neighbor of ours in Chiang Mai, and he was passing through Southampton, and he works for an organization called the Free Burma Rangers, going in and out of Burma and also Syria and Iraq. And for the last 5 years, he's been in Syria and Iraq. He's nearly 60, Paul, and he looks like an old, grizzled warrior. He's been shot at by ISIS, and he's been giving medical relief to those attacked by ISIS. He's been with the Yazidis as they were being chased by ISIS. And now he hopes, as his last big act of ministry really, to go to the refugee camps where the ISIS prisoners are. Now that's been made much more difficult by the actions of Turkey in the last few days. But he wants to go there and he wants to love on these ISIS people. And I told him that I was preaching on this text. And he said to me that he has to believe that God can turn the hearts of even these brutal, murderous, fundamentalist ISIS extremists. And he wants to go and love, and he wants to share the gospel with these people. And I find that extraordinary. But he wants to put into practice what Jesus taught here. Love your enemies. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and good, and the rain, a bit too much rain recently, on the just and the unjust. Now, theologians call that common grace, that God loves everybody. He provides the means for everybody to live and move and have their being. But this is also the standard that Jesus wants for us. We are to love, not just like other humans do, love people that love you back, but to display a supernatural kind of love, the kind of love that Corrie ten Boom wrestled with. Corrie, well, I was going to play the clip, but it didn't work too well in the last service, so let me just tell you her story a little bit. She was a Dutch person who hid Jews in her house, and she was found out, and she was rounded up, her and her sister, and they spent years in a concentration camp and suffered terribly. And I think the sister died. And after some years, one of the commanders of the camp became a Christian. And he came to Corrie and he said, "Fraulein Corrie, will you forgive me?" And she said, I could not. I could not. And she said she had to ask right there for God's love to be poured in so that she could pour it out. And she said she felt it right there. That she came to the cross, she received a supernatural kind of love. And it's a love that we can't work up. These commands that Jesus gives us, they pretty much are impossible. They're impossible without coming empty to the cross and saying, Lord, please help me. I can't love like this. Will you do it through me? And that's her testimony. So when Jesus says, be perfect, in the final verse here, as your heavenly Father is perfect, what that might mean is that the gospel now means that we are perfect in God's sight. That Jesus not only takes our sin through the cross and cancels our debts, but he also imputes to us his righteousness, so that when you stand before God, despite all the things you've done this week, despite all the things you've thought, said, and done in your life, you stand before him completely pure with the righteousness of Christ. Now, the text may be pointing that way. I actually don't think so. When I looked at the context, when I read some commentaries and things, when Jesus says be perfect, he is saying be tamim. The original word there actually means whole or integrated or complete. And to be integrated means to have all the aspects of your life matching up. It really means to act on the outside the way that you believe on the inside, for your acting to match up with your speaking. And the reason I think that is in the next few verses, as we're going to hear next week, be careful not to practice your righteousness to be seen by people, and a warning against hypocrisy. I think the context is that Jesus is bridging into that and saying, hey, you need to be acting in a way that's consistent with what you believe. So, evangelical Christians, we love words and we love talking, but we're often lacking in our actual loving, putting it into practice. And as Ruth has reminded us, real love, it may well involve us crossing boundaries. And you might not have an actual enemy, but there are people, and Ruth was talking about some of them, that society really despises. What about people outside the church every day? We've been shocked coming from Thailand to here at just walking up and down above Bar Street. We've seen people injecting. We've seen people defecating in the just right on the church, actually. Perhaps the next step for you and I in our spiritual journey, in our discipleship, is to get involved a bit more, either with the homeless or with young offenders or with refugees. That is really, maybe that is kind of loving our enemies, or certainly loving those who we would not normally love. Now then, that question that I left hanging, I want to come back to it and finish this message. How do we get the resources to love like Jesus? How is it possible? It isn't possible through our own efforts. If we're ever to pour out this kind of love that Jesus is speaking of, we need his love poured in. And we get those resources by coming empty, as Jesus says right at the beginning of the sermon, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn. We come empty to the cross. Here's a story to finish with by way of illustration. The Tsar of Russia, I don't know if it was the last Tsar or one of the Tsars before, he had a friend who died. And the friend, as he was dying, entrusted his son to the Tsar. So the Tsar raised this boy. He educated him, he clothed him, and the young man grew up and joined the army. And he actually became an accountant in the army, but his vice was gambling and drinking, and the two sort of went hand in hand. And he got so in debt, this boy, that he realized the game was up, and he thought, I've got to just end it all. I'm a shambles. And he got a gun, and he was drinking heavily to give himself the courage to take his life. But as he was about to do that, he passed out. And he was passed out on the table, and the Tsar was the kind of man who liked to go incognito and dress up as a corporal and find out what the morale of his troops was like. And so the Tsar came into this room, and he found his adopted son slumped over, and he saw the bottle, he saw the glass, and he saw the gun. And what the Tsar did was he wrote a note, and on the note he wrote, I will pay all the debt. And he took his ring and he stamped it with his signet ring. And the Tsar left. And the man woke up and he saw the note, he saw the gun, and he realized he was still alive. And he realized the Tsar has been here. And the Tsar still loves me, even though he's seen everything and he knows everything. And he's put his seal to my cause. And I think that's an amazing picture of what Jesus has done for us. He came, as it were, incognito. He's God. But he came as a man into this world. And he sees into your heart and into my heart. And he sees 1,000 things that are worse than even you can see. He knows everything you've ever done, all your motives. And he still loves you. And he wants to wipe all your debts clean. But not only that, he wants to put his seal to your cause. He wants to ally himself with you absolutely. He wants to give you a new heart so that you can be a person that is characterized by supernatural love and integrity, where what you practice matches up with what you preach. And he wants to do that for you and me. But you have to come empty. So I just want to leave you with that and hand over back to Nick, and we're going to partake in the Lord's Supper now.
To you, to see our slates wiped clean, and from that strength and power within us, Lord, to share that love.